Well, from assassinated scientists to downed drones to mysterious explosions, some argue that the U.S. and Israel are already in a covert war with Iran. And from the rhetoric we are hearing from the Republican presidential candidates and government leaders, it seems that there is a push for an all-out war with the country. Take a look.
I think our goal should be the replacement of the Iranian dictatorship.
That madman in Iran.
To keep Iran from having a nuclear weapon.
The right response to that would have been to go in immediately after it had gone down and destroy it.
If we have an avowed madman who uses that nuclear weapon to wipe nations off the face of the earth.
Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile activity poses a real threat.
I would say to the government in Iran today, you have a very short time to solve this on your own, and if you don't, we will solve it for you, and we frankly couldn't care less what the rest of the world thinks.
But I think the Iranians have to believe as well that, and particularly their leadership, believe that America would consider taking military options.
We may be past the point of no return in the sense that Iran does have inside the country everything it needs to produce a nuclear weapon.
Maximum covert operations to block and disrupt the Iranian program, including taking out their scientists, including breaking up their systems, all of it covertly, all of it deniable.
Take everything at our disposal to make sure that Iran does not have a nuclear weapon.
Would I go to war to stop them from getting a nuclear weapon if that ultimately was what necessary?
They're one of the 4 state sponsors of terror in the world.
There are training camps, jihadist training camps in Central and South America. They're working with the drug cartels, and they are planning assaults on the United States. That's what we know is going on right now.
So it seems the U.S. is eager to engage in another war, the justification this time being that Iran is developing their nuclear weapons program. And now the mainstream media is adding fuel to the fire and pushing to add other countries to the list of terrorism contenders. It's all thanks to a documentary that portrays Venezuela, Cuba, and Iran as teaming up in Mexico to plot terrorist attacks against U.S. interests. Here's a peek into that documentary titled The Iranian Threat. It's produced by Spanish-language corporation Univision.
A Univision investigation reveals an Iranian conspiracy against the U.S. government.
They say it's worse than the war troops.
Hatched in Mexico.
Digital. Yeah, digital.
Showing Latin America has become the new front line in a secret war. From Washington, Tehran, and its allies.
Post 9/11, Hezbollah becomes involved in the global cocaine trade.
The Iranian Threat.
Well, we should add that Univision, who produced that documentary, is owned by Israeli-American media mogul Haim Saban. But this documentary is being taken quite seriously by some right-wing U.S. lawmakers. It's being used as yet another weapon against Iran, providing justification for going to war with the country. So what is behind the documentary, and is this another attempt to keep the drums of war beating against Iran? Well, to talk about this, I want to bring in lawyer and author Eva Golinger. She joins me now from New York. Welcome, Eva. So this documentary is stirring a lot of controversy. How credible is it?
Well, so far it has zero credibility because none of the accusations presented in the documentary have been corroborated by any kind of other evidence. In fact, the State Department commented on the documentary and also said that they had no evidence to back up any of the claims made in that report. And again, these are accusations that we have seen reiterated over the past few years, not just against Iran, but also against Venezuela. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that in Latin America, many countries, including Venezuela, but including others, have been opening relations with Iran, engaging in more relations with Iran, but on a purely commercial and strategic level, nothing having to do with any kind of plots to overthrow or to attack the United States.
Well, what this documentary does is try to point out that there is some kind of a plot. Could there be an agenda behind it? And if so, what is that agenda and who is behind it?
There is an agenda behind it. There's absolutely no question about that. The agenda behind it, of course, is to further justify any kind of aggression against Iran. The more you talk about, the Iranian threat is now just south of the border. It's close to home. It's right here, trying to get into the United States. I mean, that scares people into thinking that they need to act immediately in order to prevent that threat. And remember that the doctrine of preemptive warfare, is still in effect. And still could be employed by the U.S. government. And the Obama administration has said that all options against Iran are still on the table. So when they talk about, bringing this Iranian threat closer to the U.S. border and that it's operating all these different Iranian intelligence operatives, agencies, and, are training terrorists in Latin America and are preparing some kind of attack on the U.S., that's really drumming up the war machine against Iran. And at the same time, we're seeing, in the case of Venezuela, that of course they've been trying to pull Venezuela into the picture here because obviously the government of Hugo Chavez is not a friend of the United States. Washington has made that very clear. Obama, in fact, gave an interview to a Venezuelan newspaper just this week and talked about Venezuela in a very negative sense and made some pretty meddling comments that provoked a reaction out of Caracas and President Chavez and indicated again that Washington plans to maintain this kind of tension with Venezuela while it tries to attempt to provoke either some kind of regime change in Venezuela itself or to justify some kind of aggression against Venezuela based on all of this pumped up, accusation against Venezuela, against Iran, against Cuba, that there's some kind of terrorist plot being prepared against the U.S. And none of that whatsoever has ever been founded on any kind of real evidence.
And I want to ask you, if deemed part of a state sponsor of terrorism as this new part of this axis of evil, what are the greater implications of that, both political and economic, because the U.S. is a major purchaser of oil from Venezuela. So what would the greater implications be of this?
Well, Venezuela, first of all, is the country with the largest oil reserves on the planet. And of course, it's very close to the United States. It's a major supplier of oil to the United States. Venezuela owns the Citgo Gas Corporation, which is all throughout the United States, and additionally has several oil refineries in the United States, mainly in Texas and Louisiana. It would have huge implications if the U.S. put Venezuela on the list of state sponsors of terror, which is an initiative that many right-wing Republicans in Congress have been pushing for several years now. And what it would do is basically break relations between the two countries. Right now, relations are frozen, but commercial relations continue. Diplomatic relations are frozen. But if commercial relations were to be broken, well, imagine, I mean, if today the price of gasoline is over $3 a gallon, it would shoot up probably over $10 a gallon if relations were broken with Venezuela, because, it's one of the principal suppliers of oil and gas to the country. And again, it would also cause a lot of regional discontent and unrest. Venezuela is not perceived by any other country in this region or around the world as any kind of threat. It's only Washington that's really been trying to portray Venezuela in that kind of way.
Well, it's interesting to hear how this could have a negative economic impact on us here in the United States. Eva, I wanted to take a moment to listen to what Hans Blix, the former head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, had to say about comparing Iraq and Iran and their potential to develop nuclear weapons. Mr. Blix, he led the UN weapons inspection team in Iraq prior to the war.
Well, there are some similarities in the escalation of the language and the threats that we had in the case of Iraq and now have in case of Iran. On the other hand, we must remember that in case of Iraq, they talked about weapons that in fact did not exist. Today, they are talking about Iranian intentions that may or may not exist.
So how would you compare Iraq and Iran in terms of their capacity to develop nuclear weapons? And could we see an Iraq situation unfolding now in Iran?
Well, it certainly couldn't be similar exactly to what happened in Iraq. I think Iran has developed a much larger defense capacity. And again, we don't, at this stage, see any kind of nuclear warhead development, nuclear arms development, Also, the Iranian government has been very clear that they are pursuing nuclear energy, but for peaceful means, and that that's within their right, and it is within their right, as it's within the right of any country around the world. And I think, again, we have to look at the hypocrisy on this issue, because remember, Israel is a country that has a substantial amount of nuclear arms, and it's gone largely overlooked intentionally by countries like the United States, even though it's something that also places that region and the world at danger. And there are other countries that are actively developing nuclear weapons who are not being targeted by the United States. Again, this is another issue of the U.S. looking to provoke regime change to overthrow an unfriendly government that doesn't serve its interests. And that's why it's thrown Venezuela sort of into the picture, because Washington doesn't like Chavez. They'd rather see him out of power. If they could just tack him on to some other issue like this one with Iran, they could just take them all out, with one military conflict or with one act of aggression. I think it's extremely dangerous that the U.S. continues with that kind of policy.
Quickly, Eva, lastly, I want to ask you, with this war rhetoric that we are hearing, is diplomacy being abandoned?
It seems as though the U.S. government abandoned diplomacy long ago. I mean, look at what happened earlier this year in the case of Libya. That was another war that was justified based on falsities. I mean, it was a case where they tried to say we're protecting the population. In the end, they ended up killing thousands of Libyans and destroying the country with the goal, really, of assassinating Muammar al-Gaddafi. And so, yes, and we've seen in the case of Iraq, the weapons of mass destruction that never existed. I mean, using some kind of issue that could spark just fear, mainly amongst public opinion, that would then be used to justify this type of aggression. And the U.S. isn't looking, in the case of Venezuela, is a major example of that. Chavez administration has been very open to respectful dialogue with the United States, but not the U.S. government looking to impose its agenda on Venezuela. And that's what we're seeing with the U.S. It's not looking to engage respectfully and respecting the sovereignty of other nations. It's looking to impose its agenda, and if they can't have it that way, then they're going to use a military option.
Eva, thank you so much for weighing in on this. That was lawyer and author Eva Golinger.